Hello, I'm continuing this recap of Carlsen's journey to World Championship, and today I'm doing the round 5 and 6. In the round 5, he met Vasily Ivanchuk with black, and let's see what happened. So, in this game, we had the Greenfield defense, which was, I suppose, one of the weapons of Magnus before he began playing more solidly, more in a more classical approach. And we had this variation of the Greenfield bishop f4. I think it's not the most critical line, but I think the main line here is just to take on d5 and to ask some questions like to get bishop g7, I think bishop e3, here knight f3, and there are lots of branches of this opening, but he chose to play in a more Queen's Gambit way, I think, I would say. And Magnus just develops normally, bishop g7, Ivanchuk does the same, knight f3, and now black castles, e3, now he's ready to recapture on c4 with the bishop. I think before that black didn't have option to capture on c4 and then to regain, to somehow save the pawn, because after white's e3, bishop would capture on c4 pretty easily. Let's say if here you take on c4, well, you can first go queen a4, queen c4, or just go e3 with recapturing on c4, because I think that bishop e6 is just too much, and the bishop doesn't belong to e6. I doubt that this can justify the extra pawn, because even in that case you can go e4 and d5 plus knight g5 is also possible, so it was never an option to capture the pawn and then just keep it there. So Carlsen just castled, didn't want any of that nonsense, e3, and now c5. A very typical move in the Greenfield. Trying to strike in the center, and usually what black does is it temporarily gives up the pawn, but uses the fact that white is still in the center, and there are some typical pins with queen a5, knight a4, knight e4, sorry, and in case of dc, which happened in the game, the idea is to play queen a5 and then to triple attack on c3, which is the soft spot of white's position, and using this slight lag in development, black will at least just regain the pawn on c5, if not even something more. And here Ivanchuk plays a very sensible move, rook c1, trying to get some control over this knight on c3. And also what's important here is that knight e4 can be met by bishop e5, let's say, and in that way white can somehow neutralize this pressure. And that's why rook c1 comes in handy, because it defends c3, and when the bishop isolates the bishop, it's okay. There's no problem on c3, so that could work. And what happens in the game is that Magnus plays rook d8, tries to somehow pin this queen and to capture on c4 next move. And you can notice that the c5 is still pretty much unpre, because there's no way to defend it. You cannot play b4, you cannot defend it by any piece. Queen d4 is just too much because of knight e4, of course. and stepping in some big problem. So white doesn't even try to defend the pawn on c5. He knows that it's a lost cause to defend the pawn, and he tries to do something else after rook d8. And that something else is queen a4. Tries to offer a trade, but by accepting this offer, you just keep the c5 pawn alive, and that's not something that black wants in this position. So he took on c5 naturally. And here white can continue to develop by bishop e2, but maybe this is what black wants, for white to spend tempo on bishop e2 and then to capture on c4. Something like that. So he tries to somehow evict this queen from c5 to make it less comfortable on this square, and he pushed b4. Magnus tries to offer an exchange, which would simplify the position and make things much easier for him, and that's why Ivanchuk just steps back to a3. I don't think that queen c6 would pose much problems. Maybe after b5. Well, now it's better to go to b4, I suppose, because a3 will just trap the knight, and there's no way to deal with this. Maybe knight e4, but you can go bishop e5, and still this knight is a big problem. If you take rook c3, still the knight is very much trapped, and so after this b5 there is d4, a nice counter strike. And the point is, after ed you can take with the rook, you can take with the knight, and basically all the problems are solved. And if you go back to d1, then there is e5, and things become very messy because the structure is not symmetrical, and with white's king being in the center still, it's not very clear. So that's why Ivanchuk here doesn't take the queen. He goes queen a3 and tries to keep queens on the board, because he feels that the queen can be a bit uncomfortable if white gets more space in the future. And now Carlsen took on c4, because I think if you just keep this tension, there is danger of some c5 at some point, knight d4, and slight push on the queen side, something like this. Oh, whoops, knight d4, c5, and I think that's something that was Magnus's concern. So he took on c4, and now b5 by Ivanchuk. And now black has to be very careful not to get into some passive position, because if you go back to e8, let's say, then bishop c4 comes with a potential knight g5, and the bishop on c8 is the big issue here. And who knows, maybe white just doesn't even want to castle. He just might play h4, h5 and break open the king side. Also, if you go queen e6, you run into knight g5 immediately, and you cannot defend the c4 pawn, so that's a slight issue as well. So first of all, queen b6 was played by Carlsen, and now Ivanchuk takes on c4, and this was the whole point, bishop e6, trying to exchange this potentially bad bishop from c8 to just eliminate the bishop. And now if white just wastes some time for bishop e2, then black develops knight b7, and let's say knight d4, you can go even queen c5, I suppose, because you cannot double the pawns. You would like to have this, but the queen hangs, and if you take it on c5, then knight c5 takes, and I guess the bishop pair is not such a big issue, because also the bishop on f4 might be exchanged anytime soon. So Ivanchuk decides here to capture on e6, queen takes, and finally he castles. And this was a very interesting moment here, because here Magnus chose to just give up the pawn. It's not obvious at the first how does he give up the pawn, but he played this move. He finished development, and there is only one small issue with this move. But I suppose that Magnus saw this, of course. The issue is after knight g5, he's going to lose the pawn, because the queen has to step away to f5, which was played in the game, and white took on e7, and the game went on. But let's go back a bit. A move that's very interesting here, that could have been played, was bishop f8. Just preventing this capture on e7, and let's say in case of knight g5 to go just queen f5, like in the game, but now you don't give up the e7 pawn, and you can continue knight bd7 and slowly catching up in development. Still, I think that white is better, because white got more space on the queen side, and because of details like this, I think white has better chances. But I think that black is quite solid in this position, and he should not. He should be slightly uncomfortable, but nothing too drastic, I would say. But Magnus chose a different approach. He tried to defend more actively, because this is much more active move than bishop f8. Bishop f8 is much more passive, because the bishop is just having one role, and that's to keep this e7 pawn. Ivanchuk does this, queen f5, and finally he took on e7, and white is currently a pawn up. But this was the point of Magnus's plan. Knight h5, trying to eliminate this bishop and to double the f pawns. Now you cannot go bishop g3, because after rook e8, the knight on g5 is going to hang. So you have to allow doubling on the f file, and that makes black's life much easier because of these double pawns. Ivanchuk plays rook fd1, and now Magnus took ef, and because the knight on d7 is hanging, you cannot capture on f4. Simple as that. Or wait, maybe something else. After queen f4, what can you do? You may even go knight e2 or knight d5. I don't know. You can check it out yourself. Magnus played bishop f8, and now it was time to go back, offering a trade which I think is not possible to refuse, because b7 also hangs. Black took, knight c4, and now knight b6. Like I said, white is a pawn up, but the extra pawn is this pawn. And white is going to have some difficulties to convert this advantage. Ivanchuk plays g3, trying to make some luft and also to support his f4 pawn. Magnus exchanges rooks and goes bishop e7, tries to prepare either rook d8 or rook c8. But I think rook d8 is not possible at the moment because of capturing knight b6. Knight d6, sorry. and then he would take on b7. But it's always good to have this 8 rank covered. Plus also against knight f6, it's always good to have some move like bishop e7. And how does white improve the position? Well, he could have gone with rook c1 and tried to get something like rook c7, but I think that even in that case, something like rook c8 would work, I suppose. And the extra pawn on the king side is not so easy to exploit. But Ivanchuk played knight f3 back. Now rook c8, trying to get some rook c2 in and to harass white's pawns. Knight e5 by Ivanchuk, and now one of the ideas is to go knight e7 maybe at some point and to offer a trade. So Magnus plays rook c7, trying to stop this, to cover the 7th rank at once, and then to kick this very unpleasant knight from e5. Because if he played f6 straight away, then knight d7 can be a slight issue, because f6 hangs, and also there is this trade offer. And if you allow this, then the bishop and pawn on b7 hang. It's not good. And if you do this, then I can take and still go rook d7 followed by knight d6 or capturing just. And this also doesn't work for black. So he chose to play this before f6, just stopping this, knight d7. And now it's time to bring the king closer, and also just to step away from any potential checks, which I don't think would matter too much. Now Magnus plays f6 and the knight goes back to f3. But also the drawback of this f6 move is that e6 becomes weaker, and also the bishop has less scope because of this pawn on f6. But I think it's much more important to not allow these knights to get to e5, g5 respectively. And I think that black is doing a pretty good job of limiting these knights. That's the biggest priority in this moment, to just limit these knights as much as possible and not allow them to jump around in the position. And you can see that there's no approach. You can get to d4, but when the king comes to f7, there's no knight e6, so black is going to do a pretty good job of defending against infiltration in the black's camp. So black goes king f7 and now h4. The point of this is just to try to get some h5 in and trying to damage the pawn structure of black on the king side. And if possible, to somehow undouble these pawns on the king side. And also, the basic purpose of this move is to just gain some space on the king side. Now Magnus activates by rook c2, and now it's time for a4. It wasn't good to play rook d2, because after this, let's say knight fd2, the king would be too active, and I don't really know how would this finish, because the king can just march towards d5, d4 and become so active that white has to be very careful to save the game. So he tries this very clever move, because you cannot really afford this because of rook d7 and entering on the 7th rank, harassing these pawns, and always having some ideas like knight d4, knight d6, which would be quite disturbing for black. So he tries to pick up this pawn on a4 with the rook. He doesn't want to allow rook d7 at any moment, because that would be just too active, and black picking up the pawn would not justify the penetration which would black experience. That sounds wrong, but you know what I mean. Now Ivanchuk plays knight c3, rook a3, and now rook c1. He cannot afford to get rook d3 because of this pin, so he has to he has to defend from the other side, rook c1. And here Magnus makes a small mistake, I would say, because he could have been more cautious and play the move, let's say, like h5, and just keep this position in a status quo, where nothing happens really, and if the knight jumps around, then you take on a4 with the rook. What if rook c2, then king can just improve the position by king e8. The only issue I have with this position as black, the only slight concern, is what happens after f5. But I think even after that, you need to move the knight from c3 to somehow use this weakness on h5. And if you do this, then rook a4, the pawns are dropping, and things become really, really messy, because you have to consider all the factors, like the passers on the queen side, the passed pawn on the king side. But I think that that black should be fine after something like this. King d8. You cannot capture because this rook can get trapped after knight d7. So maybe it was best to go h5, and if white plays f5 immediately and after this goes knight e2, you can take maybe like this, and after rook c7 to go knight c5. But still, I'm not 100% sure that this is gonna hold for black. I mean, this is all about the race, who is going to be faster with the pawns. Black is going to push his queenside pawns, and white is going to capture on h5 and then push his h-pawn. I don't want to spend too much time on this. You can check this out if you want on your own. I don't have that much time to recap this, but I think this is the better option. After rook c1, Magnus took on a4. And now knight e4 by Ivanchuk. He is stopping knight c5 to block the c file, and also prepares rook c7 followed by knight e4, knight e6, like I told before. And this is where things become a bit unpleasant, I would say. Magnus goes rook d3, rook c7, and white is going to recapture his pawn, for sure. And now Magnus plays king e6, trying to just step away from the pin, and also tries to meet rook b7 with rook d7, trying to exchange these pieces. And this was the moment to stop rook d7 by pushing g4. This was the moment to play this move. Because now, of course, you cannot go here because of f5, and the king is in a tough spot. It has to capture, and the king has to abandon the rook. King takes, and then rook takes d7, and also the bishop hangs. If king e4, then you're just taken. You're just a rook up, nothing special. So here black would have to go knight b6, but after f5, black's king becomes more and more passive, and after this, probably the best way to play is to go rook d7, but After this. Still, this extra pawn is not so meaningful because it's a double pawn and it seems like black is very solid and he should hold this, but I think this was the best way for Ivanchuk to play for a win, because even though it seems very dull, if you improve little by little, like king g3, king g4, and try to sneak in somehow, after all, it's just a small advantage, but a very pleasant position for white to play. There's no risk involved, and also you have to be careful about a7 pawn, which is a potential target, potential victim. So maybe this was the best chance, but Ivanchuk chose to play first this, and he allowed rook d7, rook b8, he avoids the exchange, but eventually he took on d7. And now the issue is that after g4, the same things don't work. Because then you have king e6 and the king might get too active and pick up on b5. It's not the same circumstance. Because in that case, king was on f7, very passive, and would not have those opportunities to be active. In this case, for example. Sorry, this one, it looks similar, but it's not. Because the king is so passive, and white doesn't have to be so careful about his moves. While in this case, the king is just so damn active, and it can jump. It can just sneak in and do some damage. So this was slightly different. Slightly. Ivanchuk tried knight d4, trying to stop king e6, king d5. But now it's time for f5, and if the knight goes back to d2, the knight goes to c3 and b5 becomes a huge weakness. Bishop c5 comes next, king can just do some damage to white by pushing to d6 and d5, so that's not coming to consideration. Ivanchuk plays knight g5, trying to hit the h7 pawn. And now Magnus takes. He also had options like h5 here, or even bishop c5, trying to disturb this knight, and then to pick up on b5, and then to put all his hopes to this a pawn. But I think the thing he did was the cleanest. I think. Bishop g5, fg, and now knight c3. Again, there are some issues with white's pawns. For example, if you just eliminate these two pawns, it's play for two results. Just white plays for win and nothing really happens. Just black is trying to defend and that's it. But in this case, white has to be a bit careful because he's gonna lose the b5 pawn eventually, and the a pawn is gonna run. So Ivanchuk has to find some counterplay by h5. And now Magnus takes on h5, which at first seems like a lunatic move, because you're just damaging your pawns. You're just making your pawns much more vulnerable, and look at this. This is just horrific. But actually, h5 was a very, very devious move. And by that I mean, well, what happens if king d6? Magnus wanted to avoid this king d6 move, because then f5 hangs. Because of small tactics. If you take, then g6, and one of these pawns is gonna just queen. The h pawn is just too far away from the reach of the knight. You cannot stop it anyway, so that's not gonna work. But even in this case, which is very funny, even in this case, black should hold. But it's not very simple to evaluate this, because after king e6, you can take on g6 take and go knight d4, let's say, king d5, knight c6. Now finally black takes on b5, but he's gonna lose the g6 pawn, and after this he's losing the g5, and this is supposed to be a draw, but I think no one goes into this one if he knows that something else is gonna work out. And here he took on h5, damaged his pawn structure, but if you take on f5 right now, then knight b5 comes, and the a pawn just runs too fast, and the king will do some support against white's pawns on the king side. So this advantage, maybe 3 against 1 on the king side, is not gonna matter much, because the a pawn is going to deflect the knight. The knight just helps the king side, and it's gonna just neutralize each other. So first he tries to get his king active and not abandon this pawn on b5, but black does what he needs to do. He needs to somehow harass the knight on d4, and then to pick up the b5 pawn, he does this, king h4, and now king d5. He needs this a pawn as some source of counterplay, and he just does that. f5 drops, knight b5, and now king h5. And now king e4. Black is ready to get to f3, capture on f2, and then get from behind and capture all these pawns. Knight goes back to e3, and now knight d6. The point is to stop knight c4, and by doing that, you're advancing this a pawn much more than you would. For example, if you go a5 right now, then king h6, a4, and then you go knight c4, and this is supposed to be winning, because if you do king d4, I think you can even take on there, and the g pawn is just too fast, and promotion comes with check, which is even worse. So black does knight d6, stops knight c4, and king h6 was played. But now there is this nice fork. Even this works for black. And now white has to capture on h7, because if he goes back, it doesn't bring him much. King f3 attacks attacks f2. And yeah, if you go knight g4, then the a pawn starts running, and you might ask yourself, what the hell am I doing? So the best way to just say it's a draw is to play g6, and after this, just take on f2, and it's all over. It's a draw. But here white just took on h7, knight g5, and after king g6, knight h3 was the final precision move, targeting the f2 pawn. And now Ivanchuk defends, but there is king f2, king f3, king f5, and now you give up the knight to be able to get the pawn, and after a couple of more moves, they just, black just gave up the pawn, and it finished in a draw. So the whole game, it was like Ivanchuk trying to get some advantage. He had an extra pawn, but as you saw, the extra pawn was the double pawn, and it wasn't so easy for him to manage to materialize this into something much more serious. And after this, the game 6 was played between Peter Svidler and Magnus Carlsen. And we had Rui Lopez. Let me check if the board is okay. It's okay. Magnus played a6, bishop a4, knight f6, and now castles, bishop e7, very typical move order for the Rui Lopez. And after d3, and now black plays b5, trying to stop bishop c6, dc, and knight e5. So he does that, bishop b3, d6, and now a4. These days we saw... Well, we saw here it's possible to just go castle immediately, and that's what we saw in the World Championship match between Nepomniachtchi and Carlsen, but he chose to play d6 early on, and what he used to do in 2013 is somewhat different, because later on he tried to delay this d6 by castling and maybe to go with d5 in one go. Just let's say if you go with something like h3, to go d5 straight away. But of course it's a different Spanish, because usually people play rook e1 and then after b5 bishop b3 castling, and yeah, now after c3 you can go d5 with the marshal. Or if you want to avoid this white, you can go first h3 and then we saw in some game knight a5. But let's not get too deep into this. Svidler plays d3, which he has covered in Chess24 course. This kind of Spanish. b5, bishop b3, and now d6. It's more Spanishy than the previously mentioned marshal. And Svidler plays a4, tries to punish somewhat undeveloped queenside. And here there are options like rook b8, I think even bishop b7 is an option. But Magnus played b4, which is also one of the main moves. Now Svidler develops, and the drawback of this b4 move is that c4 becomes a nice outpost for white. c4 becomes weakened, and it's possible for white to use it. Black castles, and now he tries to first get a5 in. And with a5 he's trying to disconnect the b4 pawn from his comrades. Let's put it this way. The only way that black can connect these pawns is to go c5 at some point, but that also brings some questions about the d5 square. And here Magnus plays bishop e6, not being too afraid of doubling the pawns, because it might also bring some stability in the center, plus maybe some jumps on the king side. And also, yeah, some counterplay on the king side. So that's why Svidler doesn't want to allow that and goes knight c4. And now rook b8. Just being ready to defend this pawn, and also being ready to meet c3 with the rook on the semi-open file, to just capture and to be prepared for such scenario. I think it will, yeah, it's meant to be just to discourage the c3 move, but Svidler plays c3 anyways. Magnus takes bc, and now h6. Yeah, this move is played against knight g5 for sure, just trying to secure his bishop on e6. Nothing more to say here, it's a pretty normal move. If you play something like, let's say, queen c8, then you might have to look after knight g5 and after this f3. If you go to h5, you can argue that the bishop is very bad. And if you go to d7, then you might want to consider not playing this because of f4 and some minor initiative on the king side. So this was the most sensible move against both bishop g5 and knight g5, but mostly knight g5 because bishop g5 with the bishop on e7 is not such a huge threat. Now rook e1 by white, also a very typical move, just aimed against d5 in the future because e5 becomes very soft in that case, in case black plays d5. Now queen c8 prepares both queen b7 and rook d8, trying to push d5. And the reason why this is a very legit plan is that d3 is also quite weak. And even if you take, hypothetically, this pawn on e5, the d3 pawn, which is going to be very weak, is going to compensate for that potentially lost pawn, let's say. And now Svidler plays bishop c2, which is very interesting because it invites black to capture on c4, which would damage the structure of white. It was possible to just go h3 and wait for black to do something, but I guess he would play rook d8 and furthermore prepare the d5 push. By knight d7, let's say, somehow bishop f6 and then d5, let's say. Just to over-defend the e5 and then to push d5. But he chose this one, and this was a very interesting moment because black could have taken on c4 at this moment, and after dc, to go knight d8. With idea like knight e6, knight d7, knight c5 to make a blockade on these pawns. And the way to continue for white could have been to go bishop a3, to counter this move by knight e5, and because of this pin, it's impossible to just get knight e6. That's simple. So black would either have to go back to c6 or just go queen e6 with knight b7 next, knight d7 and knight c5, the other plan. But probably Magnus had different plans. After bishop c4, dc, d5 becomes impossible to push. And after bishop c2, black chose to play rook d8. Magnus tries to push d5 at any cost. He tries to get his plan done. And he doesn't want to capture on c4. And now Svidler plays queen e2 very cautiously because he wants to put his queen away from the d file, which might get opened, and you usually want to secure your queen from the rook. When they're on the same file, you want to get the queen out to just avoid some pins. And again, you can take on c4 as black and do something like this and knight c5 and continue, but Magnus had different plans. He played bishop f8. he's not hurrying with d5. He wants to put his bishop to safety, because in some variations the bishop on e7 might be a liability. And Magnus figured that it was better just to keep this bishop on f8, where it's pretty much safe. It cannot get hit by the heavy pieces on the e file, so he put bishop on f8. And also, this is a kind of a waiting move. And probably what Svidler should have played is just to wait himself, h3, to play something like this. And still, d5 is not enough, because knight e5 will come. So probably black has to capture or do something else, because it's so tough to push d5 at this point. You can take on c4, take knight d7, and still get your nice play, knight c5, and maybe this knight comes to g6, and the game continues. But Svidler plays knight e3, and the problem with this move is that it loosens the grip on the e5. And this allows Magnus to play d5 immediately. The e5 is not so pressured anymore, and now d5 becomes much more realistic. Svidler took, knight d5, and now Magnus makes a small mistake. He takes with the rook. Although it was possible to capture with the bishop. And maybe he missed this. It's not so good to capture on e5, because after capturing rook e8 is very strong. And now the queen has to capture on e8. There's no way to avoid this, because rook on e1 is loose. So queen e8 is the move, and now you don't capture back, because it just means that you're a pawn down, bishop e3 comes, and black is without compensation whatsoever. But after queen e8, black has a very nice, well, I can say it's Ivanchuk, because it's a very surprising move. Queen g4. Now black attacks the queen, attacks g2, and white has to give up the queen by queen e4, and then you take rook e4, queen d7, and black has a queen for bishop and rook. But I think that, and a pawn, let's say, yeah, and the pawn, but I think that black is much better here. The bishop comes to d6, and just these pieces are going to dominate the whole board. But Magnus took with the rook, and he kept his e5 pawn alive. And now Svidler plays h3, trying to stop bishop g4, for example. But this was the moment maybe to equalize, or even get the better position after queen e4. And now white tries to just provoke something like f5 and then go back. And the e5 becomes irreversibly weak, because you cannot play f6 anymore. There's no option of that, and there are some issues, some big issues with the e5 pawn, like bishop f4, for example, the simplest instance, or bishop a4 as well, just to loosen the pressure on the e5. Also, if you go g6, well, again, like I said, bishop a4 is a huge resource in this case. And if you take on a5, I take on e5. And yeah, I also want to go knight g6 next, which makes it very, very tough for black. Well, not so tough, but slightly unpleasant. Black has to play something like bishop g7, because otherwise you're gonna go knight g6, and that's not acceptable. Bishop g7, bishop f4, and white is doing just fine, if not even something more. But Svidler plays h3, and this allows Magnus to get some initiative. First he plays bishop f5, disallowing queen e4, first of all, and second of all, just putting pressure on d4. So he tries rook d1. Now he brings the queen in and tries to double potentially on the d file. And now Svidler plays bishop b1, trying to stop rook b8 and prepares bishop a2, but now queen d7 happens, and the issue with white's pieces are that they're somewhat clumsy here. There are two bishops on the first rank between these rooks, which should ideally be connected. But in this case, it's not happening, and also there are some lingering threats like e4. e4 is a very strong threat at the moment, trying to blast open the position, and when the bishop comes to play, it's gonna be very, very dangerous. So now Svidler plays bishop e3, and now it's time to play e4. Using this loose rook on d1, and that's why white plays knight d4, Magnus takes, and now bishop d4, which is a mistake actually. It was much better to capture with the pawn, but still black's advantage is, black's position is much more pleasant, because after, let's say, this bishop d3 exchanges. This one, black's structure is much better, because his c7 pawn is much more defended. You can go bishop d6 at any time and to defend this, and there's no way that white can endanger this pawn. While on the other side, a5 pawn is quite weak. Bishop on e3 is tied to defending the d4 pawn, so I would not really like to be white in this position. And I don't say it's lost for white, far from that, but it's very tough to play. But after this, it becomes even tougher to defend this. And this was the moment for Magnus to just grab this advantage and to win the game on spot. But here he played ed3. He just took on d3, and he hoped for triple capture on, let's say, bishop d3, this, and to play c5 and to use this loose rook on d3. But we'll get to that very soon. What was stronger than ed3 was bishop takes h3. Using the fact that the bishop on b1 is useless, doesn't defend the king side at all. Also, other pieces are not much more useful than the before mentioned bishop. And if you take on h3, I take it. And what do? If you go bishop e3 to stop rook g5, I go bishop d6, and black has enormous threats, like rook h5 or just queen h2, queen h1. That's just game over. Let's say if here you play bishop if you play f4, let's say, I simply take. And if queen h2, well, you can go f2, right? And if this, rook g5, and in this case, just queen f3, and it's game over. So bishop h3 was the best move, and the critical line was after what happens after d4. Now black can remain this pin on the g file, just keep this bishop alive. And now when white tries to keep his g2 pawn alive by g3, there was one very, very nice tactical shot. Bishop g4 first, and the point is after f3 there is rook b2. Deflection of this queen on e2, which defends f3. And now you can just play queen e3, but once you allow the rook on the second rank, it becomes really tough to do anything else. You can just cry after this. Bishop h3, and the g3 pawn becomes a huge target. So let's see what happens after queen takes. After this, bishop f3, and now the g3 pawn hangs. There's also queen h3 next. Also the rook hangs. I said that, but okay. And what happens? Rook d3, you can take on g3. And if, let's say this, rook g2, and you lose the queen. If you go here, then I give first this check, and somehow later on you're just going to get to the second rank. You have to, and then rook g2 comes with capturing the queen. So maybe that's something that Magnus missed or didn't want to get involved, but he played this move. Bishop d3 takes, and now c5. It seems like black won a piece because the bishop cannot move since the rook hangs. But actually this can work. Bishop e5. You attack the rook on b8. Now Magnus took on d3, bishop b8, and now c4. A very clever idea, just getting all his pawns on the queen side on the light squares, far from the bishop's reach. Impossible for bishop to endanger these pawns, and also preparing bishop c5, which is even more important because you want to put pressure on f2 by bishop c5 and eventually rook d2. So now the bishop goes to e5, trying to defend the c3 pawn at least. Bishop c5, and now rook b1. And now it's not time for rook d2 because c4 hangs, and bishop f2 is not such a huge issue because that's just one check, and well, not here because of rook d1, but just go to h2. And I think that black should be fine, white should be fine here. There's no reason for concern. So Carlsen is being prophylactic here, and he plays queen d5, preparing rook d2, and then hitting on f2. And maybe this was the moment for Svidler to play rook e1 here. Oh no, not like this. Rook e1. And then to meet this move by queen g4, for example. attacking g7. And if black goes f6, well, then to go bishop f4, and in case of rook c3 to go queen e6. Actually exchanging queens. After this rook a3, rook a6, and after c3, let's say, then to just go rook c6, and I think this is holdable because the bishop is stuck on the rook on a5 is stuck because of the bishop. And I think black will have tough time to push this pawn any further. If you push it immediately on c2, I think after this you don't have plenty of choices, because every single piece is stuck. If the bishop moves, then c2 hangs. If the rook hangs, if the rook gets here, then can you do just bishop c1? I think you can. And if bishop a3, just get closer and pick up this pawn. Although it's not very sure. After this rook a1. Well, you can just go king b2, I suppose. Although there is this. Well, is there? I think you survive as white. Check it out. I don't have time. So I think rook e1 was better just because of queen g4 idea, targeting g7, and if f6 I mentioned bishop f4 with queen e6. But here Svidler plays rook b8 check and goes for a very sneaky trick. King h7 and now this move. But this simply doesn't work. And what was the trick, actually? Well, the trick is if you play some random move, like, let's say, if you play bishop e7, for example. There is a very simple, very, very nice tactic. Well, in this case, it's actually even queen f5 and this checkmate, but the whole point was rook h8 immediately, and after this to take it and give a checkmate. But of course, Magnus sees that and he plays queen e4, because now if you go with this check, king h8, this one, you have queen h7 back and you cover all the things. Also, the cool thing about this queen e4 move is that it covers all the checks on this diagonal, and there is no queen f5 or something like that. Plus, you keep the pressure on the bishop, so there's no queen f7 because you give a check and then you take on e5, so that's out of question. Svidler plays rook b2, but now there is this issue with the bishop. The bishop gets pinned and he tries this, but there is a nice check. King h2, and after f6, black is just losing. Black is winning the piece. Black wins the bishop, and in this position, Svidler resigned because, first of all, there's no perpetual because there's no check on the light square diagonal, and second of all, he's gonna be a piece down, which is even worse. And that's it. I hope you learned something new, I suppose. And I'll see you tomorrow with more games. I think it's game 7 against Rajabov, and after that I think I'm gonna see what's I don't know what's next. See you soon and take care. Bye.